Okay, thanks guys. Good luck. Have fun.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We'll be getting started in just a few minutes as everybody enters the Zoom room. A few announcements while we're waiting to get started. Just to note that closed captioning is available via the live transcript button at the bottom of your Zoom window. And also to find out whose land you're on, please visit the link that will be dropping in the chat below. And while we wait to get started, please add your name, pronouns, and how you are connected to or engaging with community design in the chat. Today's event will get started soon. Thanks. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today. We'll get started in just a few minutes as folks enter into the Zoom room. Just a few announcements as we wait. Closed captioning is available via the live transcript button at the bottom of your Zoom window. And to find out whose land you are a guest on, please visit the link that will be dropping in the chat below. And also as an icebreaker while we wait to get started, please add your name, pronouns, and how you're connected to or engaging with community design in the chat as well. Today's event, Perspectives on Practice, Exploring Pathways in Community Design, will be starting shortly. Hi, everyone. If you're just joining us, just wanted to share a few announcements as folks enter into the Zoom. Closed captioning is available for those who wish to utilize it by clicking on the live transcript button at the bottom of your Zoom window. And also to find out whose land you are a guest on, please visit the link that we've dropped into the chat. And also as we wait to get started here, as an icebreaker, if you could, please add your name, pronouns, and how you're connected to or engaging with community design in the chat. We're going to get started here in a minute. Hi, everyone. Just sharing here an announcement while we're allowing folks into the Zoom. You can utilize closed captioning via the live transcript button at the bottom of your Zoom window. We've also included a link in the chat for those who may be interested in finding out whose land you may be a guest on today. And while we wait to get started, please add your name, pronouns, and how you're connected to or engaging with community design in the chat below. We'll get started here in just a second. All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. I want to quickly just introduce myself. I'm Nick Gurton. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm part of the ACD board. I'm currently located here in the Hudson Valley of New York on the occupied land of the Mohegan, Wappinger, Shkagatuck, and Munsee Lenape tribes. And I'll be supporting today's discussion as our moderator, and I'm grateful to everyone for joining today. Wanted to share a little bit of information just about ACD and some of the programs and support services we offer our members. So our mission here at ACD envisions a practice of design that dismantles systemic injustice and creates an equitable built environment. Through our programs, we provide resources, connections, and support for practitioners working to advance equity and justice in the built environment. One of those programs that we offer to our members, and which I'm really excited to share, is an upcoming opportunity with the ACD Fellowship. We'll be bringing this back after a successful 2022 fellowship cohort. And this fellowship is open and welcome to any ACD members able to make a 6-month commitment to participate in monthly 90-minute circles of practice and quarterly special mentorship events. Links to the application are available through our website and social media channels, and you can apply by July 9th. I also wanted to share that we have our upcoming annual membership meeting this Thursday, June 29th at 7 p.m. Eastern. We're hoping that we can see a lot of the folks attending here today at our annual membership meeting, where you can learn more about the organization's upcoming initiatives and strategic objectives. More information about this and registration can be found on our website. And then finally, I just want to share that today's event is actually part of an entire series of webinars that ACD has been putting on, entitled Pathways in Community Design, Careers, Practices, and Projects. Today's event is the third and final of this series, and recordings of all webinars will be made available to ACD members through our website. Just a quick reminder that this presentation is protected by US and international copyright laws. And I also just wanted to quickly share some expectations for our webinar today, including that all participants will be on mute mode, but you can drop questions, comments, and engage in discussion through the chat. And again, a reminder that ACD is recording this and it will be made available to ACD members later through our website, and closed captioning is available via the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. So today, I'm really excited to welcome 3 amazing individuals to our panel. We're joined by Delma, Palma, Lily Song, and Abygail Manger. I'll offer just a brief introduction since each of the panelists are going to share more about themselves in a moment. Delma is the Vice President of Design and Construction at Empire State Development. Lily is an Associate Professor of Race, Social Justice, and the Built Environment at Northeastern University's School of Architecture. And Abygail is a Transportation Infrastructure Program Oversight Analyst at Booz Allen Hamilton. So I'm really excited to jump into today's discussion, and the panelists are really going to be covering some important topics that I think all of us here will use to examine both our relationship to community design work and the communities that we serve. Our panel will plan to focus on a variety of entry points into community design, how practice can respond and evolve in relationship to community, and how these perspectives can inform the value judgments or principles that we utilize when navigating through realities of our practice. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a moment so that we can meet the panel. So Delma, Lily, Abygail, thank you so much for being here today. I think by way of introduction and also getting us started, I'm wondering if each of you can share a little bit about your work and how that's involving community design practice. Delma, if you could kick us off, and then we'll jump to Lily and then Abygail.
Thanks, Nick. First of all, thanks for having me and us, and really excited to enter in conversations with everybody. So my work is currently and has primarily been in the public sector and in housing. So I have the belief that public services is a really high impact place to work in the different communities that we all come from. It's not a career path that I knew much about when I first went to architecture school or thought about what I wanted to do. So I do think it's also a career path that needs a lot more support and transparency for people to come into. Housing is an integral part of life and flourishing. And so that's why I've dedicated my career to providing housing options for those who don't have many housing options available. The place I just started this new job, so the place that I just came from, was working in public housing in New York City, which in and of itself is the size of a small city. So I got to learn a lot about sort of the history and how public housing works in the US. Another key aspect of that, since it was such a large portfolio, was the interaction of the public realm and stakeholder engagement, because the public realm is, where civic life happens. So a big part of my work in community design was working with all of the different stakeholders, whether they're our residents or elected officials, and helping that inform the public realm and the projects that were happening in the housing itself. So now just a little bit about my current job. I now work for Empire State Development, which is New York State's economic development corporation. So I'm working on their real estate development projects, a lot of public realm work as well, including if you've heard of Penn Station, which is the busiest train station in the US, sort of the public realm around that train station, what it can look like for the next generation.
Thanks, Delma. Lily?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm also really excited to be here and to be in conversation with Delma and Abigail and Nick. And so I'm I'm an urban planner, activist researcher, and an educator who's based at Northeastern University in Boston. I teach graduate and undergraduate courses to mostly architecture students, but also urban planning graduate students on topics of participatory design and planning and community development. And my work largely focuses on community-based infrastructure mobilizations and experiments that advance environmental and spatial justice. So kind of to give you a flavor of some projects that I'm currently working on, I saw someone here is working at UTL in Boston's Chinatown, but one of my projects is also in Chinatown. I'm working with the Asian CDC there and Pal Art Center on a public exhibition that looks at the role of the arts and cultural organizing in Chinatown struggles for spatial justice. And that's going to open later this summer. Through my anti-displacement studio that I teach at Northeastern, I've been working with the city councilor, Tanya Fernandez Anderson, who represents District 7, and community leaders in Roxbury who are really interested in reclaiming vacant parcels from the city and using them for to create green, open, and recreational spaces that are safe, healthy, and culturally affirming. And then a final project is one that's just starting out. I'm working with some environmental justice communities in Boston. I put that in quotes because actually they are characterized by environmental injustices, East Boston, Dorchester, et cetera. And we're doing participatory action research to inform Mass Save, which is a statewide energy efficiency program that is largely incentive-based, and we're trying to investigate how it could be more equitably accessible to advance energy and climate justice.
Thanks, Lily. Throw it over to Abigail.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for making your way here. My name is Abigail. I am an urban planner, environmental engineer, and public policy analyst by training. I lend most towards the planning lens right now. I'm passionate about how we nurture mental health and well-being through the neighborhood development outreach process, as well as thinking through the design outcomes, both of those equally. When I look at planning, I look at it through a social determinants of health lens. And so my roles in the past few years have lent towards graduate education, focus on that mental health lens of planning and the engagement process. I've worked previously in some consulting fields doing parks-oriented planning of, as well as general master planning of thinking about when it comes to mental health. Two big areas that we know nurture our mental health are arts-based community development, access of the arts, and access to green based development, green spaces, parks, stormwater. So that's what I look for with my roles. And as Nick mentioned, I'll be soon also transitioning to a new role at Booz Allen, where I'll be getting to focus on that transportation lens of thinking about access and how access lends to health.
Awesome. Thanks, Abigail. So I think to start, Delma mentioned a bit earlier, just the idea of like knowing how to get into this work and knowing the variety of ways that are coming that are possible when you think about entry points into a community design career, into how we first come to do this work as practitioners. And so I think, Abigail, I'd like to first start with you and just hear a little bit more about how you came to this work and how you first got involved in doing this type of social impact and community design practice.
Yeah, sure. So I went to undergrad at University of New Hampshire, and my degree focus at that time was environmental engineering. I wanted to build green communities, think about how we can be more sustainable and how that is good for all fronts. And I ended up in my last year at undergrad working at the Office of Multicultural Student Affairs, where I learned a lot about how our social identities, our privilege shapes what our neighborhoods look like, and the disproportionate burdens on BIPOC and low-income communities. And so when I graduated and I entered the environmental engineering space, where I worked at a federal agency, I just felt super removed. I felt like I had learned all these things about racial equity or racial inequity, and I wasn't really applying it. I was writing a paper that might get to someone, who might read it, who might do something about it. And so I wanted something that balanced people and the foundation of engineering. And through a lot of Google searching and conversations, that's how I found urban planning. It seemed like that middle ground where it would have the opportunity to influence a more local scale. And so for me, I felt like my entry point was kind of two-pronged, of one being the multicultural office, where you learn a lot about the history of how, where I learned how history of how neighborhoods were developed in the US in particular. And then through urban planning as a tool of privilege and power, of how it has the capacity. I've always said, if it had the capacity to cause trauma, then it has the opportunity to nurture healing. So that's the lens of how I see how urban planning has the ability to be a trauma-informed field to have better design outcomes.
Thanks, Abigail. Lily?
Sure. So so much of what Abigail just said really resonates with me, and I think we have some intersections. But I started out as an undergrad at UC Berkeley. So I grew up in LA and I went to Berkeley to do my undergrad studies. And so the people on the right of the slide, these are all like teachers and mentors who have really opened up, like new ideas and opportunities for me. I think we often rely on the wisdom of, others, people who we admire and respect, and that has certainly been the case for me. So the person with the hat on to the left, that was one of my favorite undergraduate professors, Robert Allen, who teaches in African-American studies and ethnic studies. And so, growing up in LA in a highly segregated and unequal environment, kind of like what Abigail just described, I didn't really understand why things were that way, and my location within that, my own sort of positionality. And so through ethnic studies, I was able to kind of unravel that. After graduating, I went into a nonprofit called the Asian American Drug Abuse Program in LA. And they're mostly working along the Figueroa corridor that stretches from South LA all the way to the ports. And these are areas that are heavily exposed to environmental injustices, highways, pollution, all of that. And we were working on community health and environmental justice campaigns as members of Community Coalition. And that's when I met my mentor, Mia Yamamoto, who's up there on the right. And she was and is a criminal defense attorney. And I knew that there were things happening that were more upstream than the community organizing work I was doing. And I really wanted to kind of intervene at that sort of structural or systemic level. But through various sort of personal circumstances, even though I wanted to go to law school, I ended up learning about urban planning and going to study urban planning at UCLA instead. And I think this is to say that life isn't really linear, and sometimes things you want don't happen and other things happen, but then somehow it kind of make sense later on. But that's sort of what happened for me. And when I went to UCLA, it was a time, I went in 2005 is when I started. There were a number of professors, most their picture there, Jackie Levitt, Gilda Haas, Abel Valenzuela on the bottom right. They were working with local sort of labor movements, immigrant surveying community organizations and doing action research. So that's the kind of urban planning I learned. And that got me really excited about research. And I signed up for 5 more years of that, if you can believe it. So I did, I started the PhD program at MIT. And that's where I met Phil on the bottom left, Phil Thompson, and worked under his mentorship and guidance for 5 years. And I'll pause there because I think we're going to talk about more of this story later on.
Awesome. Thanks, Lily. And then Delma, over to you. Same question. How did you first come to this work?
So yeah, I think my influence starts really from early on. I grew up in Florida. My parents are Honduran immigrants. So I grew up in a place that is very environmentally and financially vulnerable, because the community I grew up in was primarily an immigrant community. When I went to architecture school, which I went to University of Notre Dame, I knew I wanted to design buildings that helped people's economic mobility, because I saw that that's what it had done for my parents. Like slowly through stable housing, they were able to keep going. And so I did that, and I moved to Washington, D.C. after architecture school to work at a firm called Torrey Gallison Partners. They still do a lot of master planning, affordable housing work, and I was really interested in doing that work. So I worked there for several years, loved doing the design work, but I increasingly was kind of itching to make some of the critical decisions about like the actual social impact of the places that instead of just design decisions, like how many, homeownership units are we providing? What's the depth of affordability of this place? Like, how is it connected to transit? And so things at a slightly higher level. And so from that, I was exposed to the Enterprise Rose Architectural Fellowship, which I know several folks here are familiar with. And that was really a game changer, because that's a fellowship that, puts architects and now artists and landscape architects, different types of designers in ownership roles or in places like community development corporations, in my circumstance, a housing authority, or for developers. And has their design expertise influence the decisions that are being made. So with the Enterprise Fellowship, I was able to move to New York City, work for the Housing Authority, and it really kind of cemented my investment in working in those types of communities, particularly because if you're a housing authority, you're a long-term asset holder. You're going to hold on to that housing for forever. And so you really care about the people that are there, how they're engaged or how they're not engaged, and how the places are designed and maintained. And maintenance has always been a big thing for me about the built environment and the public realm. And so that, I think those were different angles and entry points for me into different spaces.
Thanks, Delma. I think that's a really good segue because, Delma, you just mentioned it, but I think what's beautiful about what everyone's talked about here is just the sort of aspect of this of how the work relates to people and to place. And even though like maybe coming from different angles at the work, whether it's like larger scale urban or environmental planning, or from the academic and research side of things, applied research and participatory planning, or from the public sector, right? I'm hearing a lot of just interconnection between all three of you around how this work has really been, primarily about people and about the places where that work is occurring. So, I'd love for us to next maybe talk just a little bit about how each of you have seen your work either evolve or how it's been informed in relation to specific people or specific places that you've practiced over the courses of your career. And I'll throw it to Abigail here first.
Yeah, so I think when it comes to how we look at places, we're often thinking just strictly in the built environment of what could be there, and not enough emphasis on how assist what is already there, and not just in terms of the built environment of what cultures exist there, what movement of how people use the space already exists there, what places hold value for residents versus those that people don't feel connected to. And I think that emphasis, when we look at this idea of social determinants of health, each of those pieces of when we develop something has the ability to have us feel more connected to a place or less connected, which then impact our mental health. So the reason many places end up not being successful is because we haven't centered in mind how people use and interact with spaces. We just think developers might come in and say like, oh, this is missing a grocery store, let's just put this giant thing here, but not really think as much about how do people get to these places? What does it have their culture's food there? Or what else form of connection? Like, who are you buying for just as an individual? Are you buying for a whole family? And so I think what helped me with urban planning was it helped me have a very focused idea of what people, how they interact with a place, from not just that development lens of what's in the built environment, but on the financial lens, on the people lens, to think about things like a heat island area or a food desert, or where there's job access, like thinking holistically of how a city or neighborhood is this ecosystem that all have pieces needed to function.
Thanks, Abigail. How about we'll toss it over here to Lily now.
Thank you. So let's see, how am I going to talk through this slide? So what I love about the community design space is that there is such an emphasis on people in place, as opposed to like, isms. Like oftentimes in architecture school, there's people who know so much about modernism, or, in social science environments, like, oh, people who are experts in social networks, or just like things and concepts. But here we're really passionate about people in places, right? And the diagram, with the eyes and people holding hands speaks to, for me, I mean, growing up, in an immigrant family in an ethnoburb in LA, I was surrounded by, people like myself and people of color, immigrants who didn't speak English as their first language, women, othered people, right? Caregivers who are underappreciated by the world, but who actually know so much about how the world works because it's not designed around their comfort. And so the quote on the bottom, it's long. You're not supposed to put a long quote on a slide, but there it is. But, it's about infrastructure and how oftentimes infrastructure, and we see it with transportation, digital infrastructure, whatever, it enables so much, right? Social reproduction, but also it allows us to really change things. But most importantly, when you look at infrastructure-based struggles where people are like, protesting and trying to change highways or shut them down or whatever, they are led by frontline communities, and people are trying to, they're envisioning a different sort of world, right, and future as they come together and mobilize and experiment. And for me, the sort of marginalized groups for whom the world isn't built, I've always really been, just inspired by the visions that they have for how to change things. And so, if there's anything about people, I feel like regardless of the place, that's who I naturally gravitate toward. And the question is like, how can an urban planner or designer be an accomplice to that, right? Because we have certain skill sets, right? But we don't necessarily always have that kind of place-based like wisdom, experience, all of that. So, I'm not going to go too much into the details of each of these locations, but, LA, growing up in LA, I was politicized by the 92 uprisings, and so much changed in LA after that. A lot of the labor and immigrant movements grew up in a different way after that, and got really strong, and started organizing around spatial justice. So I mentioned the work I was doing at UCLA that connected to that. And, when I came to Boston for grad school, I mentioned the Mass Save program that I'm working on earlier, but in 2007, early 2010s, there was a lot of sort of, there were conversations about energy efficiency and what that would look like and what kind of jobs would be created and all that. So my dissertation focused on high road energy efficiency jobs and how they could sort of lift up, enrich communities of color in particular. And, because of just personal circumstances, again, the nonlinear sort of things that come at us in life, I ended up moving to Southeast Asia. And I connected with a nonprofit there that does participatory planning research. And I've been continuing some work with them. And then, in Boston, I mentioned the 3 projects earlier, but it's more that, kind of who has systemic insights, and then how do we work as planners and designers with them to really, transition in a just way.
Thanks, Lily. I think there's a lot there. We're going to keep unpacking in a little bit with our next question too. So I'm excited to hear more about that in a second. But before we jump to that, Delma, I just wanted to hear a little bit more about how your work has maybe evolved or, responded to the different places and people that you've worked with.
Yeah, I think what Lily said is spot on, right? Like we all recognize the importance of people in place. And something that I kept seeing over and over and over again, regardless of the people I was working with or the place I was in, is the really intense need for better housing and better public realm. So I've lived and worked in, dense urban communities, rural ones, suburban ones, and I always saw this. So the picture on the right-hand side is actually when I was working for a nonprofit in South America. And I just saw the precarious living conditions everywhere that I went. So that's, what really drew me to doing that work in a contextual way. So the other photos you see are of Richmond, a neighborhood I worked in Richmond. And the map shows the public housing and how it was developed in the city of Richmond. And it's very clear what side of the highway they're on, right? So I also realized that observation is extremely important, not only desktop studies, but actually going in place and observing the communities where you're going and doing work. Yes, Don, Richmond. And so I make a huge effort to live in the communities where I'm serving, or if not, spend as much time there as I can. Because when you can watch people interact, you can be a part of those events, the local culture. It teaches you how the place, should be designed, how it should be built, how it should operate. And so just a little bit about the many hours that I spent in New York City's public housing. I learned that the New York City Fire Department actually trains on public housing doors because they're very robust. And so they just break down doors regardless of whether people are there to open them for them or not. I learned that people of every generation like to garden and farm, and that almost all of our apartments were being overheated. So these, small and big things that I learned just by being in space and like actually observing, and not just saying, I read that this is what's going on to you. And so, yeah, I think that's how I've embodied the practice.
Thanks, Delma. Before I jump into this last question for all of us here, I want to just again offer the opportunity for folks in the audience, if you do have questions or ideas or thoughts based on what you've been hearing so far, to feel free to throw those in the chat. We'll be doing a Q&A here in a little bit. But before we get to that, we've got one of the last questions I wanted to get everyone's thoughts on here. And it's really about, for me, thinking through these first 2 questions and how they have influenced maybe the principles or the values that you're applying as each of you navigate through like work environments, through institutions, through the systems that we all have to contend with, whether they be, our employers or, different regulatory agencies or, just even like societal level systems that we're all reckoning with. And so, I'm curious to just unpack a little bit more from each of you, just how you're really applying those questions, how you're applying those value filters in thinking about future work, future initiatives, and just evaluating the potential of the impact of a project that you may be pursuing. So I'll start with Abigail.
So for me, I have worked in federal government, I've worked in private planning consultancy, I've worked in nonprofit organizations that were hundreds to thousands in a sector versus like an organization where it was less than 10 people. And so for me, I think this question of knowledge and or thinking about different sectors and institutions is more about the person as an individual and where they feel fulfillment. When I was at a federal agency, or even a nonprofit that was a national scope, the emphasis was a policy lens of thinking very high level. And what made it challenging for me, it felt very removed from people for me, where you're most like to evaluate a system. I don't know if people could heard that, but a thunderstorm is about to happen where I am. But yeah, you're evaluating people and less so interacting with them, which was really hard for me when thinking about built environment. And when it was that middle ground of I had internships at state government, or even in the consulting field, the clients were counties or some large cities. What I noticed was that emphasis on like that, their role is kind of like a facilitator or collaborator to try and bring the pieces together of what they needed from a policy lens and making connections to get groups together who had that more neighborhood level lens. And then on that kind of grassroots, small community development organizations, those are the people who are the experts on knowing what people are going through. They're going to doors, they're walking through communities. And so I had to figure out where I fit on that scale of where do I want to be and where do I feel most fulfilled. But also thinking about thinking of different sectors from the lens, there's also the thinking of different sectors from the values. So in consulting, I worked at one firm where they acknowledged like sustainability and equity, social justice, equity were very important to them. And if they felt like projects were with potential clients who didn't have that much in mind in that lens, or were very much about how do we achieve a bottom line and an economic thing, they weren't going to pursue it. And I spoke with other firms who said, we're a consulting firm and it's about us making a profit. So it was really informative for me, even like as someone who was interviewing for jobs relatively recently, that I knew for me that equity values lens of how we leave a place in the future is how I could feel settled and well about what I was doing. So I put this chart on the right here of thinking about these kind of ideas about participation and where we are. And I often think what sector we're in informs when people say engagement or outreach, what they think that is. And to me, the goal should be as much as empowerment at the top of that scale as possible. I usually don't like the word citizen being used. I prefer resident just because citizen could be exclusionary. But that idea of how do you encourage as much people who are experts of where they live to be involved, and where I feel that I could feel set in that.
Thanks so much, Abigail. Lily, how about you? How are you approaching this?
Sure. I think this is such a good question, Nick. And, you touched on principles and values, and, every single person in this room right now applies certain principles and values to our work, right? And we're all navigating and contending with different systems. And, in terms of the consulting firm that Abigail just mentioned, even the one that chooses not to advance sustainability or equity is making value-based decisions, right, about what's important and what isn't. So I think the more we reflect on our work and like what were moments that we felt really strongly or uncomfortably about things, like, sometimes it takes time to figure out what exactly our values and principles are. And I think a certain level of control over our time and resources to actually make decisions on what work we choose to take on or not based on those values and principles. So, it's to say, for me, it's been a bit of a journey. And I have this just transition framework up here because this framework synthesizes a lot of the values and principles that inform my work. And so this is really about divesting from the extractive economy where we are presently and trying to invest in and transition towards a regenerative economy. And there's different aspects to this, from the worldview, consumerist and colonial versus more caring and sacredness based resource extraction versus regeneration, enclosing wealth and power versus, really focusing on well-being, ecological and social, and then militarized governance versus deep democracy, right? And, as Abigail mentioned, the scales of work, there's different scales at which we could practice this. I really gravitate toward place-based, community-based partners that are really trying to make the shift. And the 3 examples of work that I shared, I think that they're doing different aspects of this work. Let's see, what else was I going to say? Oh, I think for me, as a university-based researcher and educator, there's certain kinds of navigation that I have to do too, just to kind of put out there that within community design, there's different sort of sectors, right? And I do believe education is one of them. And there's a certain kind of extractive, abstracted way that architecture and design is often taught in universities. And so I think for me, choosing, pedagogical and like curricular approaches that are aligned with this type of a shift is an important part of the work as well.
Thanks, Lily. So much there for us to keep getting into. I'm gonna throw to Delma before we jump into some Q&A with the audience.
Great. Yeah. So I think one of my biggest values that I chose in pursuing my work is service to the public or the whatever community that I'm in. So that was my decision in sort of pivoting to the public sector because the client was the people. So I think in the public sector, you can create things like policy documents, like Abigail mentioned. There's one that I worked on that either sit on a shelf or you can actually try really hard to get people to use it and to engage in projects that change the system. But it doesn't come without its challenges, definitely. These institutions are typically large and can be difficult to navigate or influence. It definitely depends on which agency you're in, what level of government you're in as well. They also have racist and unjust policies and procedures that have to be unraveled. Here are some historic posters that you can see about urban renewal. And these things have to be unraveled usually one by one. So like it's a slow process, but I think I've been very fortunate in my experience that the people that I've engaged with in government really want to make the system better. I also totally agree with that chart is amazing that Abigail put up. I think that like one of the ways that you can have citizen or resident control is to have people in the government, particularly people who have been historically excluded, be participating and being in positions of power in the government, spending public dollars, making those public decisions that are pretty significant. I also, one big value that I share is transparency. And I think that that's that's legally required in government, and not something that I saw in many other places that I worked. So this is an image on the right of the public housing sites, the map of New York City, and you can go onto the website and see information on a project happening at any and every one of these sites, and it's just readily available to the public. And because that exists, there's a level of accountability. I mean, we can debate accountability on many ends, but it's if the information is out there, it's accessible for people. And I think if we work in the built environment, we have to be held accountable, not just to what we're doing today, but what it's going to leave for generations in the future. And so I think that transparency is imperative to that.
Well, I think there's so much there for us to continue with, and I could keep asking questions all day, but I want to first see if there's, Michelle, I don't know if we've had any questions come in the chat for our panel while everybody's been talking here.
No, not yet, but there's been a lot of love and shout outs to the things you guys have been mentioning throughout. If anybody wants to raise their hand and ask a question out loud, please do so. Otherwise, also type into the chat.
Well, while folks are thinking, maybe I'll just take this opportunity to ask one other question for any and all of you. So I think we talked a lot about this throughout the day and our remarks, but the sort of idea about, you know, the individual values or principles that are being applied in the systems we're working within. I'm curious where you all see like either opportunities to encourage or challenge like some of the larger systems or institutions that you're operating within to more closely align with the priorities we've talked about here today, or the priorities that inform your individual work. And I'll just sort of leave that as an open-ended question to anybody who wants to maybe take a swing at it.
I think for me, that question more has to do with thinking about your individual level of knowing how to push through. I've worked at many organizations where you come in, especially as a younger person, as a person of color, as a woman, where your ideas are often dismissed, or it's like, oh, you just have to learn and you'll get there. And there isn't a lot of as much value towards the people-centered side. It's the scoff to, that's more expensive, we don't have money for that, or that's not, you don't have to do that, of thinking of it as this burden lens and realizing to get that people emphasis, you're often going to have to reassure yourself that you're doing it for a reason, because you might be the only one. I worked at a previous organization that was a member organization, and the members were local municipality leaders. And when I was first told about making an agenda regarding health and resilience, they told me, think about whatever you're passionate about in terms of health and resilience and release content about that. And I was like, well, this is a member organization, so I'd like to have like conversations, like focus groups or meetings with the members to understand their lens of what they're looking for or what challenges they're facing in that intersection of health and resilience. And people looked at me like I was crazy. They were like, what? You don't usually have to do that. I haven't talked to the members in years. And I found that so strange. And sometimes you have to be the person that people think is strange to get that people emphasis first, because it's not people's inherent idea unless you're in a field or have worked with colleagues who understand that really is the emphasis. I think for me, having a parent who did work in public service, I always thought of a career of how will I serve? And I realized that was a rarity. And so when you're thinking about people first, I think that's more of a lens where you're going to have to push through.
I'll add something short and sweet, which is just, I think maybe it's because of my background of growing up in Florida, and now living in New York, where we just, had the Canada smoke everywhere. But I think just climate adaptation and resilience, that needs to be as serious as the building code now. And I think people, still see it as an elective, and frontline communities, like we all know that they're the most hardest hit. And so it's just like really has to be a priority, instead of something that's, an add-on. It's just getting more and more extreme. And I still don't see like the urgency that I think we all need to be pushing.
Nick, do you want to take this question from Veronica, or should I speak briefly to the question you posed?
If you have
Should we
something
pivot?
to share, Lily, no, we could, yeah, let's pivot. Veronica, do you want to share your question?
Oh, no, Lily, I'd love to hear from you, and then I can add in a question.
Oh, thank you. So, to the question about how do we sort of maneuver and how do we intervene to make sort of within institutions to push changes, what are the opportunities right now, right? I think by definition, institutions and systems, they aren't supposed to change very well. And so it's sort of on us. And honestly, my closest colleagues are not fellow professors at Northeastern. They are people who live in Boston, they're neighborhood activists, like people who care about environmental justice or whatever, right? People that I have relationships with, friendships with, and they're like my colleagues. They're the people I'm building with. And I think the way that we're set up, like Northeastern's a private school. Should I say this on the record? That's okay. But, we all work within like systems of capitalism, right? And like firms make profits and universities make profits. So it's natural we're not going to find like our change-based kind of colleagues there, right? So I feel like a lot of the work we're going to do to create change is going to be outside of work hours, and it's going to be based on our values and the things that we gravitate toward. And nowadays with social media, I'm grateful that it's easier to find our people and to be able to share like what it is that we're passionate about and to kind of, build movements with folks.
Thanks to all three of you. Veronica, do you want to share your question?
Yeah, that's actually a perfect segue into what I was going to ask. And I think each of you have a very interesting, unique background, which kind of speaks to this. I right now work as a design engineer, have a background in civil engineering. So I work planning all the way through implementation, and I'm sort of navigating, like evolving that career. And I'm curious your impressions of the role of higher education in that process versus just experience, right? And sort of the advantages to academic institutions, or perhaps the drawbacks, because certainly there can be programs, at least, that you get stuck in a silo where you contribute to this academic facility, but don't necessarily have that integral like participation or knowledge of how to actuate those elements in a working society. Yeah, so just kind of wanted to hear from each of you of how you've navigated your career in that regard.
Veronica, to clarify, do you mean like academic institution for for degree programs and to advance that, or do you mean within like work in terms of working within them?
The first, former, yeah, for education.
I think I may need the question repeated again.
Yeah.
Okay, let me try rephrasing. I guess the question largely is just like, how do you see, or what programs perhaps do you admire in this field? Just because I think there's a difference between advancing your career, choosing to advance a career, using education as the vehicle for that, or using different roles as the development for that. And I think my hesitation towards higher education is sometimes you just then get siloed in this academic sphere, where I am a civil engineer and I do try to pull academic journals as much as I possibly can to say like what's going on, but there seems to be a pretty big, or there can be a very large divide between policy or investigations, research, and implementation of those elements. So just sort of how you've navigated your career and made decisions to pursue higher education versus pursue fellowships where perhaps it's like, you know, a combination of those things, or just other career changes that give you that opportunity?
I think for me, honestly, that decision, I also I was environmental engineering, which is very close to civil. And I worked for a few years before I went back to school. And I think at that age, especially early years, I felt like I had to get the degree to be able to do work in this lens. But as years have passed, I realized that wasn't actually fully necessary. It might have it gave me foundational knowledge, but I met so many people who just went straight into the field after graduating, even with environmental engineering degrees, who ended up doing design work, planning work. And I think we have these big bucket of broad names of occupations, but we end up doing a lot of similar work. And so I wouldn't say that a degree or higher education blocks you off. For planning, I don't know anyone that I wouldn't say I wouldn't know anyone. I'd say there's maybe 2 people who I met who had engineering or planning backgrounds for my program when I started. There were people who did philosophy, they did geography, they studied the arts. I don't think at all your education silos you to feel like it limits you from being able to do work. But I also don't think it's necessary or a requirement to be able to do this work. The idea of choosing academia, higher education versus a fellowship, like you mentioned, to me, I think that's more of a question of honestly socioeconomic privilege of what capacity do you have to potentially do a fellowship that's a year that might be lower pay usually, or go do school full time, which also has a cost in itself. So I think if you see a fellowship opportunity that feels aligned and you have the capacity to financially do it, then do it. Don't feel like just because it's not this higher thing that society has deemed as a certain level that you have to turn down something else that seems great.
Lily, Delma, any thoughts?
I'll just do a quick piggyback and say I totally agree with what Abigail said. And Veronica, if you didn't do further school or a fellowship, but you put yourself out there and reached out to a bunch of people whose work you admire and share with them what you're excited about, and, built relationships that way, and, kind of moved yourself towards things that might open up new possibilities. You don't know that could be as exciting. These are just new spaces that give you time and resources to kind of, build yourself. So there's different ways of doing it.
And I'll say just one other thing. I think we're as a society in a cultural shift where we're starting to realize straight to academia doesn't have to be the way to achieve things or our values. There are all these different other means of how to do it.
Delma, anything you want to add in there?
I agree. I'm the only one here. I think maybe without an advanced degree. And I think you just want to continuously learn. However you do that. I did a working fellowship. That was the way I wanted to do it. And I think if I ever pursued a master's degree because I want to learn about that topic, and I'd probably do it while I'm working because I love to work with people and to keep doing that. So yeah, I think, what Lily said is true. You can enter spaces without the huge commitment, and maybe of an advanced degree or even a 2-year, 3-year fellowship, and see what interests you and what keeps you learning and advancing in the place you want to be.
Awesome. Well, thank you all. And I know we're a little bit over time here, but I do want to just take a moment and see if there's anything in closing that any of our panelists want to offer before we hop off here.
I think for me, I just know that there's so many people in this room who could share their journeys and their stories too. And thank you for inviting us to be in conversation. And I look forward to being connected with the ACD community.
I think that's a perfect way to end it, Lily. Thank you for sending us off here. And I want to thank Delma, Lily, and Abigail for their time and joining us today in this conversation. And I want to thank everybody here in the audience as well for joining today. Just a reminder again that our annual membership meeting is this Thursday evening. We hope to see everyone there. And also applications for the ACD Fellowship Cohort for 2023 are also open now until July 9th. And I think with that, I will send us off. Thank you, everybody.